I am your host, Chris Martinson, and it is December 20th, 2016. Now, these are troubled times. It's getting harder and harder for everyday folks to pretend otherwise, as carrying the weight of the self-delusions begins to exceed the cost of waking up and squaring oneself with reality. Whether we're taking our cues from the ecological sphere, where the sixth great extinction is well underway, or from the political spheres, where such things as Brexit and Donald Trump speak to the growing unease of the masses, or from the monetary sphere, where central banks seem desperately afraid to find out where even a minor correction in financial asset prices might lead. Add it all up, and you understand why we've been exploring topics and guests on this program that dare to confront the existential crises and dilemmas that we're actually facing. From Stephen Jenkinson recently, we harvested much, including the powerful idea of, I can't go on, I'll go on. I can't go on, I'll go on. How does one exactly go about squaring up one's actions with the known realities of the day? These are truly extraordinary times, and for those of us who are alert and awake, ordinary no longer cuts it. We can feel that something more is required of us, and perhaps we've even lost interest in the ordinary and become prickly, if not impossible, holiday party guests as a result. I know I have. But here we are, together in these times, and each of us must go on. But how? And in which direction? There's a fascinating book just released this past August of 2016 that lays out a compelling vision of powerfully different new economics for a post-growth world, which is drawn from the work of David Fleming. And that book is Surviving the Future: Culture, Carnival, and Capital in the Aftermath of the Market Economy. It was edited into being by today's guest, Shaun Chamberlin, and has a foreword by Rob Hopkins of Transition Town fame, who's been on this show before. Let me now introduce our guest, Shaun Chamberlin. Since 2005, when he self-ejected from the typical working world, Shaun has devoted himself full-time to exploring the dominant cultural stories and myths that chart the course for our society and, in particular, how we might change direction before we end up where we're headed. His work has been featured on the BBC and been discussed across the UK press, including in The Guardian, Sunday Times, Independent, Daily Express, as well as Time Magazine, Bloomberg News, and the Financial Times. He is the managing director of the Fleming Policy Center and has been involved with the Transition Network since its inception, leading to his co-founding Transition Town Kingston and authoring the movement's second book, The Transition Timeline, which I know many of you listening to this already have. He is also Chelsea Green Publishing's commissioning editor for the UK and Europe, and has served as chair of the Ecological Land Cooperative, a director of the campaigning organization Global Justice Now, and an advisor to the UK Department of Energy and Climate Change, as well as co-authoring the all-party parliamentary group on peak oil's report into carbon rationing. His writing roams across social, political, and spiritual themes, as well as popular explanations of climate and energy issues. Very wide-ranging. Very happy to have him on the program today. Welcome, Shaun.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here.
So, Shaun, please begin, if you would, by filling us in a bit more about your origin story. How is it that you came to be doing all of those things I just listed?
Okay, so I was working about 10 or 12 years ago. I was working in a learning center for marginalized groups, so working with young asylum seekers, people with mental health problems, drug misuse issues. And I really loved that work, but I in my spare time was learning at that time, especially about sort of climate change and energy depletion issues, and feeling like, well, hang on, I'm helping people to reintegrate with society, but society itself seems to be running off a cliff.
Mm-hmm.
And in that context, I started feeling like, okay, that's really where I want to put myself. But I didn't really know how. I didn't really have a peer group around that. I didn't really see any great organizations that were doing work I wanted to get involved with. So I think it was in 2005 I left that job and basically learned to live really cheaply. Like absolutely minimize my expenditure so that I could live off the money I'd saved while I was working for what turned out to be about a year. go to conferences, read books, harass interesting seeming people. And then in 2006, went down to a place called Schumacher College in the UK in Devon. And they were running a 2-week course there called Life After Oil. And there I first met David Fleming, who you mentioned, and Rob Hopkins, who was at that time basically saying to us, "Oh, I've just had this crazy idea, transition. Do you think it might go anywhere?" And yeah, a few of us thought it really could go somewhere, and so hooked up then with a real peer group, and that's probably the fortnight at Schumacher College that's very much shaped the decade that I've spent since doing all those things that you've just listed.
So it was just a 2 week adventure that really nudged the rudder of your destiny.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that, as I say, I've been reading about it in my spare time, and it was after about a year of reading around that I felt like that Schumacher course was where I needed to be. But that was definitely where I found, it's very easy to think that you can solve all this stuff on your own surfing the internet, but you really do need to hook up with some kind of community, and that was where I found my community around it.
Hmm. So I'd like to turn to the book now, Surviving the Future, and I have to confess, I'd not been exposed to David Fleming before your edited version landed
Mm.
on my doorstep. So before we go to the book, let's back up a bit. Is based on the work of Mr. Fleming, who you were close with. What sort of person was he? Tell us about him.
Yeah, well, I should make clear because I don't think we've mentioned that he passed away at the end of 2010. Um, yeah, David was a was a historian and an economist by training, but he in the 70s was involved with the founding of the Green Party in this country, and a thing called the Other Economic Summit, which was founded at the time as a sort of counter summit to the G7 as it was at the time.
Hmm.
Um, and uh, and then out of that grew the New Economics Foundation, and much later he was one of the key inspirations behind the Transition Towns movement. And his real passion, I would say, was community. He was fascinated by what community is, how it works, what seems to be going wrong with it at the moment, and his friend Jonathan Porritt, who I've come to know quite well, tells me that in the 70s he remembers David urging other sort of ecologists and ecological politicians to learn the language of economics because they were constantly being told what you're saying is completely impractical for economic reasons. And so he was urging his colleagues to do that, and he was good to his word, and he went off and got himself a PhD in economics in the end. But his economics was very much about confounding and challenging the mainstream and some of the fundamental flaws in our mainstream economics that you know all about, Chris.
Right, I can summarize. You don't here. If anybody needs a PhD in economics, here it is. Economics, as it's currently practiced, centers on just two words, and those words are must grow. That's
Right.
it. I've just shortened a whole lot of study. There's some detail under
See, if
that, but
David had
that's
met
it.
you 40 years ago, it would have saved him so much time.
Well, and so much springs from that. Once you really understand that the imperative, the assumption set that underlies all of economics is fundamentally irrational because it's
Mhm.
saying that we're going to grow infinitely on a finite planet. Any elementary school student can work that out on a napkin. It's not hard, but it is hard because so much is invested in that not being a false assumption.
Mhm.
But so here we are. So much of David's work then must have been about just attempting to crack that nut and help the status quo defenders, as they are, understand that they're really defending a very false construct.
Yeah, absolutely. But also, I think, as you'll be well aware, there's a real frustration in engaging with the status quo defenders in that they've often got so much skin in the game that they're really not willing to face that. I think was it Upton Sinclair said that
Mm.
it's very hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
Hmm.
And so very often it would be more a case of writing towards and engaging with that, but the people who were actually hearing the message weren't necessarily the defenders of the status quo. It was much more the likes of strange people like me who were coming at it from more of an external perspective.
Right, right. Now, David Fleming was working on I guess a grand vision, a grand piece of work that was, I guess, as I understand the story, unfinished at the time of his unexpected death in 2010. Tell us about that work.
Okay, so the work you're talking about is called Lean Logic, and it's a dictionary for the future and how to survive it. And it really is, it's an utterly unique, impossible to characterize book. I mean, one of the reviewers put it rather well. They said, "I have never encountered a book that is so hard to characterize, yet so hard, despite its weight, to put down." And I mean, John Michael Greer described it as an encyclopedic guide to the crisis of industrial civilization, and it really is as wide-ranging as that would sound. It's an incredible work, and it's in a way he sort of pre-invented Wikipedia in that it's got these sort of stars that link between the different entries, and so you can follow the path of your interest through the book. It's sort of choose your own adventure book in a way. But as you say, he passed away just before completely finishing it. I actually, although we'd been working together very closely for 5 years at the time of his death, he'd never let me look at the manuscript for Lean Logic because he said we were too close and it was too close to his heart. And if I was critical of it, we'd fall out. He didn't want us to fall out. um, and so it was only after his death that I actually found this manuscript on his home computer and started reading it and was absolutely blown away and started talking to publishers about it. And some of the feedback was that while it is incredible, it's huge. It's sort of 350,000 word hardback book.
Oof.
Um, and it's in this very unconventional dictionary format. And so we started talking about the possibility of some more accessible version, which is what you've got, which is Surviving the Future. And that's, as you know, a conventional read it front to back paperback book. And I've basically selected one of the potential pathways through Lean Logic, the dictionary, and edited it lightly to turn it into this sort of narrative format book.
Well, fantastic work for that. So, how many? You've selected one possible narrative thread through the
Mm.
book. Out of how many?
Oh, I mean, endless. I mean, there are, I
Endless.
think, I mean, there are hundreds, I think more than 400 entries in the dictionary, and they're, thoroughly interlinked in the same way that Wikipedia articles are. So it's like saying how many possible paths are there through Wikipedia? It's just, you could start anywhere and head in any direction. And yeah, this is just the path that I thought would be a good. I mean, someone described it well. They said it's Lean Logic is a bit like being set loose in this vast natural reserve with endless areas to explore. Surviving the Future is a bit like having a guide take your hand and show you some of the highlights and give you a sense of the lay of the land. And then a lot of people, once they've read Surviving the Future, then think, oh wow, I'd really like to wander off on my own and explore a bit more. So in a way, it's my guided tour of a region that one could explore in whatever way one desires.
Well, fantastic. So, Shaun, take us down. What path did you choose, and what will people find there?
Hmm. Well, I mean, in many ways, in Surviving the Future, I focused on David's economics because I think that's the kind of core, most sort of radical thing about his work, and in a way, the framework off which everything else hangs. And one of the things I found particularly enjoyable is that at one point he takes the seven sort of core tenets of free market economics and goes through each of them one by one and explains in his very entertaining style um, how we need the exact opposite of every single one of them.
Hmm.
And really, I think you might say that his one of his core points is that while you and I and your listeners know very well that independence from the mainstream economy absolutely makes sense, relying on the markets and there being stock in the shops for long-term security would be a very bad move. But we do have to be a little bit careful because our societies tend to fetishize independence. And that can lend us a sort of tendency to get carried away because while the mainstream talks about sort of financial independence as being the goal, I don't rely on anyone, I've got my own money, I'm a self-made man and all of that, and that's very much held up as a heroic thing. But of course, it's a myth because if you're financially independent, someone else is still growing your food, someone else is still producing everything you use. So you still are dependent on people. You're just dependent on people you don't know. But then I think the sort of green or prepper version of that is this idea of self-sufficiency. And there are a lot of good things about self-sufficiency, don't get me wrong, but the danger there is that both the financial independence idea and the self-sufficiency idea can be very much influenced by this kind of Hollywood myth of me as the hero of my own narrative. And what I think David encourages people to do is think about the question of identity. He makes the argument that identity is absolutely crucial to any rational decision. If you don't know who you are, how could you know what you should do? If an antelope forgot it was an antelope and decided to go and be on the side of the lions, then its rational decisions would look very
Hmm.
different. So while there's nothing to disagree with in the statement, we need to take responsibility for our own well-being and prosperity, the critical question underlying that is who is we, who is our own? And while the Hollywood story can be really helpful, because sometimes we do need to step up as a hero, I think Fleming's work really emphasizes that far more often the root of successful long-term prosperity is we as family, and most especially we as community. Because as the kind of formal market economy continues to crumble, we urgently need to rebuild the informal economy of social capital, the non-monetary economy that even today allows our society to exist. This is the economy of all the things we naturally do when we're not otherwise compelled to do some. So, music and play and volunteering and friendship and home. And this has been massively weakened, this informal non-monetary economy, by the sort of invasion of the market economy. And so Fleming argues that the sort of key challenge today is repairing the atrophied social structures on which actually historically most human cultures have been built in order to rediscover how to rely on each other again rather than on money alone.
Now, this is a theme that I've got several podcasts under my belt on, which, and let me see if this is in the right direction.
Mm,
It's around the concept of tribalism, where all of culture now, and this is true of almost every place on the planet, except very few exceptions, are all hierarchical in nature, and the kind of economics we practice very much are support the persistence of that hierarchy. And hierarchies enforce some things and punish other things. And when you get right down to it, given where we've placed nature on that hierarchy as somewhere well below any
hmm
humans on this particular list, we're starting to run into the shortfalls of that as a concept. And that's something I think you talk to any ecological scientists who are deep in grief, they're like, yeah, no, this is totally not working.
Yeah.
And I think increasingly average people who maybe spend less time focusing on that are beginning to be aware that something's amiss. And here's a way that I noticed this that seems to catch people. Um, I was born in 1962, and during our summer trips, we would get in the family station wagon and we would drive from Connecticut to upstate New York, where my family had a summer place. And every
hmm
time we stopped for gasoline, you would have to get out and clean the windshield off because it was just smeared with bugs. Otherwise, you couldn't
Right.
see. Right? I can make that drive now and not get a single bug in August on the
hmm
windshield. Right? Whether I'm consciously aware of that or not, somebody of my age is aware of something really profound that is shifting, that feels really primal, right? It's like
Right.
I might
Yeah,
not
I
be
think there's a
aware,
book out at the moment called the Moth Snowstorm by Mike McCarthy, which is based on that exact thing. Yeah.
right? And so I'm wondering in this reformation of economic principles that
Mm.
the economy has always sort of been cast as the primary thing. Everything else is sort of secondary or subset of that. In David's work, how does the economy begin to go more into, say, the biophysical economic sphere, which sort of says, no, the economy is actually a subset of other intact functioning systems, and if those are good, the economy can be good. If those fail, it will fail. Or is where does he place the economy in human endeavors?
Well, no, yeah, he's absolutely saying that what we first need to care about is the well-being of the system in which we exist, which is the ecology, which is Gaia, which is whatever name you want to call that, and that one of the, as you say, one of the absolute fundamental flaws in our current economic system is that it has no sense of being a subset of the ecological system whatsoever. And I mean, Lean Logic in particular, the full work, goes into great detail into the kind of ecological and systems thinking basis on which we can build an economy which has a future. And one of the more surprising things I think in his books is that he talks about this concept of intentional waste, which seems to be sort of contrary to what everyone thinks of as sensible economic management. But he points out that there's an important difference between your foundation capital and your growth capital. And foundation capital, which is, for example, the well-being of the ecology, you absolutely need to conserve. But growth capital, if you keep accumulating it and preserving it and accumulating it and preserving it, then that's the kind of economic growth which ultimately destroys the system that it's depending upon. And so, whether by instinct or understanding or accident, historically, former societies have devised all sorts of ways of getting rid of this excess, whether that's these sort of competitive potlatch ceremonies of mutually assured destruction, or the idea that the people who acquire the highest status in society are the ones who give away the most rather than the ones who accumulate the most. And I think that's something that's a challenging aspect of David Fleming's economics for a lot of people, is this idea that actually we need to rediscover the principles of intentional waste of growth capital.
Intentional waste of growth capital. Interesting.
Mm.
Now, I was taken by a quote that Rob Hopkins had chosen to put into the forward. And that quote from David is, localization stands, at best, at the limits of practical possibility. But it has the decisive argument in its favor that there is no alternative. So what I take from that is he's like, look, this localization thing, at best, it'll sort of work. But the jury's still out on whether that's a possibility or not. But there really is no alternative. So I'm getting a sense of a man who's peered into the future and said, this just doesn't work. Right? There is no path to sustaining ourselves by other means as we've organized ourselves. That this direction we're headed really has no future. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, the entry in his dictionary on globalization begins by defining it as a brief anomaly. He says this short-lived model of connectedness and incoherence will not outlive the conditions of cheap and abundant energy on which it depends. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at this point it might be worth doing a little reading from Surviving the Future, which I think might give a good sense of his overall vision in that way.
Fantastic. Please do.
The great transformation has already happened. It was the revolution in politics, economics, and society that came with the market economy and which hit its stride in Britain in the late 18th century. Most of human history has been bred, fed, and watered by another sort of economy, but the market has replaced, as far as possible, the social capital of reciprocal obligation, loyalties, authority structures, culture, and traditions with exchange, price, and the impersonal principles of economics. The market's achievements and answers sound authoritative and final, but what is truly most significant about them is how naive they are. If the flow of income fails, the powerfully bonding combination of money and self-interest will no longer be available on its present all-embracing scale, and perhaps not at all. And it must inevitably fail, as the market's taught competitiveness demands ever-increasing productivity, and thus relies on the impossibility of perpetual growth. In the meantime, the reduction of a society and culture to dependence on mathematical abstraction has infantilized a grown-up civilization and is well on the way to destroying it. Civilizations self-destruct anyway, but it is reasonable to ask whether they have done so before with such enthusiasm, in obedience to such an acutely absurd superstition, while claiming with such insistence that they were beyond being seduced by the irrational promises of religion. Every civilization has had its irrational but reassuring myth. Previous civilizations have used their culture to sing about it and tell stories about it. Ours has used its mathematics to prove it. Yet, when that relatively short-lived market society is gone, we will miss its essential simplicity, its price mechanism, its self-stabilizing properties, its impersonal exchange, the comforts it delivers to many, and the freedoms it underwrites. Its failure will be destructive. And the end is in sight. During the early decades of the century, the market will lose its magic. It is the aim of lean logic to suggest some principles for repairing or replacing the atrophied social structures on which most human cultures were built, as the basis for a cohesive society that might survive the turbulent times to come.
Brilliant. What a concise summary. And the questions that spring up, I think, at any point in time when you're saying, well, this system really isn't working. I'm
Hmm.
wondering, here are the three questions that I challenge people with at seminars. You say, look, you finally come to this conclusion that all of this will kind of be changing, whether you agree to that or not. So your three questions boil down to this. What things are you going to stop doing right away? So there might be some things in your own personal narrative in life that you say, this doesn't make sense anymore, right? Commuting 2 hours or something, or whatever, however you want to put that. So what do you
Hmm.
stop doing, right? That's question one. Question two, what brand new things are you going to need to entertain doing? But then the center mass of it, probably 80% of it is, well, what things are we going to keep doing, right? Because humans are going to keep
Right.
wanting to have children and enjoy themselves and make music and have fun and find deeper meaning and all of that. That's still true. So I'm wondering, in that context of what do you start, what do you stop, what do you keep doing?
Mm.
How where does this work in surviving the future fall? Is it saying this we have to really blow this up and start almost entirely over, or is this really getting at that sense of we have to jettison some things and bring on some new things?
Hmm. Well, I'm put in mind actually of a line from the writer Jeremy Leggett, who reviewed the book and said that it's less about what we stand to lose and more about what we've lost already and stand to regain if we do things right. So I think in many ways, as in that extract that I just read, David's talking about a lot of the stuff that we've already stopped doing. The great transformation has already happened, but we've already lost so much of our social capital, of our community integration, of our culture, of the joys of convivial living, and become much more atomized and much more separate. And so in a way, I think we need to stop stopping doing those things. So we need to restart and rediscover many of those things. And of course, what's quite notable is that the market economy has, as far as possible, replaced the informal economy. So loads of things that we would never have dreamt of paying someone for. We now pay someone. So rather, maybe you're bereaved, but rather than talking to your friends, you talk to a paid counselor, for example. And the market economy has pushed and pushed in, and yet still the core of our economy, the thing that keeps everything going, is still the informal economy. It's still families that raise children, that teach language, that teach the basic skills of being a person. There's a story told about a father um, giving a bill to their child at the age of 18 for all that it's cost to raise them
Hmm.
over that time. We would never dream of doing that. So it's still the informal economy that's the basis, and that's what we're going to keep doing. I think is being human, actually, in a way that the market has tried very hard to steal from us. I think it's that sense of human cultural well-being that we need to both keep doing and build and recover and rediscover. And I think what's been a real guiding principle for me over the last 10 years is this idea of resilience. And the thing about resilience is that it's not let's predict the future the best we can and then adapt to that. It's let's adopt the course of action which makes sense across the widest possible range of possible futures. And I, for quite a long time now, haven't been able to find motivation for courses of action unless they make sense in both a collapse and a non-collapse scenario, if you like.
Hmm.
So, trying to reduce the emissions of some industrial process, well, I have no interest in that, because in a collapse scenario, that doesn't really get us anywhere. Um, but rebuilding community and culture, well, that makes our lives better today in our current way of being, but it also provides, in the what I see as the more likely collapse scenarios, it provides an informal economy to catch us when the formal economy stops holding us in the way that we've become used to over recent centuries, I suppose. And what's really exciting about that for me is that it's not, you know, me or David Fleming or anyone else having some brilliant new idea. It's actually just based on what historically supported humankind throughout the whole of history up to a couple of hundred years ago, really. So basically, it is just recovering what we lost during that brief anomaly of globalization.
Well, I completely agree, and everybody who gets into this business of wanting to share the troubles with the world and starts with data, rapidly discovers that data has no bearing on the conversation whatsoever. That
Right.
ultimately people change because their belief systems get altered, and now we have biology telling us that that's an energy expensive proposition. So evolution has said, do that sparingly, if ever, right?
Hmm.
So there's sort of this inertia, this to barrier to activation that we all have to sort of climb over. And the energy of our times is that the narrative is the mythology is starting to crumble. And
Hmm.
boy, that's going to be an expensive proposition. And I totally agree with David. We're going to lose a lot. And we're going to look back wistfully at some point and say, man, that was easy and tasty and wonderful. And why
Yeah.
didn't I use all that free time I had more elegantly? Because I wish I had that back. That's amazing.
Yeah, I
Uh,
spoke to a chemist once and he said, you have no idea how beautiful hydrocarbons are chemically, the things we could do with them. And people are going to look back and go, what, we burnt those?
we burned them.
You burnt them? Like,
Right? Great grandchildren unborn are going to say, you liquefied natural gas. That's what you chose to do with it. You chose to take 25% of its resident energy to turn it from a gas to a liquid. You didn't
right.
build anything with it. So you
Yeah,
could
yeah.
ship it for a few extra bucks. Really.
Yeah, totally.
Genius. Just genius, you
Yeah.
guys. Right?
Yeah, we've got an agricultural system that's based on basically turning oil into food, and now we're learning how to turn food into oil. It's just madness.
and on and on. So my question then comes to this point of saying, look, there's the data, but if the data doesn't really lead to change, how do we get to change? And in my own career, I've had to really now wander heavily over into the fields of psychology and marketing and behavioral psychology and particularly behavioral economics and other places that don't start with any illogical presumption that humans are rational creatures, but say, yeah, we're
Hmm.
kind of this amygdala with a little something wrapped around it that we like to
Yeah,
call free will, but really isn't if you study it. For the
yeah.
most part. So given that we are these organisms and that we are behaving in many respects just like any other organism that found a big vat of sugar and decided to
Hmm.
have at it, what really is in your experience so far, whether your own personal or through your connection with Mr. Fleming, that talks about how we begin to make this transition, maybe not from a material standpoint. I've got a garden, I've got or even a social standpoint, which I've got deeper relationships, but from that emotional standpoint of
Hmm.
altering from mythology viewpoint A to what's sure to be someday proven to be mythology B, but knowing we have to transition to from one way of thinking to another.
Yeah.
How do we go about doing that?
I mean, I guess there are two questions. One is how do we do it ourselves, and the other is how do we help encourage others to do that.
Yeah.
And in many ways, the one technique that I found that works for both of those is just gently highlighting, whether to yourself or to someone else, the contradictions in our positions, because we all have them. We absolutely all have them. I mean, there's a wonderful line in David's work where he talks about hypocrisy, and he says, hypocrisy is a good thing with a bad name in many ways
Hmm.
because it would be troubling if someone's ideals weren't better than the way they lived. um, but uh, but yeah, noticing the contradictions, and if you're talking to someone else or writing to someone else, gently pointing out those contradictions and then leaving them alone and letting them mull them over. Because if you push someone, if you're saying, "Hey, that's a contradiction," then they're just going to get defensive and they're going to push back, and you're not really going to get anywhere. And what I've found personally is that when I start exploring those contradictions, it very often goes to a very dark place because we are living in a situation where the whole society and culture that we grew up in is heading for the buffers, and so all the things that we've learned to rely on, all the things that seemed like certainties in our childhood, are crumbling, and that is just inherently a deeply emotionally challenging thing to face. And so I think, I mean, I see it all the time when if you get to say environmentalists in a room, the conversation will always be the same. You'll have one of them saying, there's no point in acting unless we have radical change and revolution, because without that, we're just addressing symptoms and not the real problems. And the other person will be saying, well, there's no time for that. It's overwhelmingly urgent. We just have to act within the frameworks that we've got now. And I've heard this conversation hundreds of times,
Hmm.
in all sorts of different contexts. And the reason those are very rarely resolved is because they're both right. We do need radical change, and there probably isn't time for it. And so, it's really hard for them to acknowledge that, for any of us to acknowledge that, because if it is too late, if where does that leave us? Just despair, giving up. What use is that? Um, and what's really important to do in those situations, I think, is not immediately jump to an answer, but live with the questions that we have and let them settle in us. Because we can often forget that sustainability is a temporary construct. As you said, we're all going to die ultimately, and like the sun's going to burn out ultimately, so life on Earth isn't. Sustainability is actually always going to be a temporary state of being. So if we make that our aim, we're always going to fail ultimately. And so there's this kind of awful experience, the dark night of the soul that people talk about, of sitting with something that you deeply care about and deeply value, and recognizing that maybe you can't save it. That maybe, I can't make civilization sustainable. Maybe I can't, I don't know, save that species that's going extinct, or save that person who's dying, who I love. And that dark night of the soul, there's no way anyone can do it for you. But what I can say is that, having absolutely been there myself, it doesn't end you. If you can sit with it and sit with the pain and not distract yourself by working incredibly hard or by denial or by argument, but just sit with the thing that feels true, even though you don't want it to, then there comes a day on the other side of that where you wake up and you go, wait, so I'm still here, and that kind of dark night didn't end me, and now I have to decide what to do in the context where that thing is true that I've been denying my whole life. And actually, that's kind of a good feeling, because it's incredibly draining denying that all the time. Living a life which is based on contradictions, but you can't bear to look at them, is an incredibly exhausting thing, actually. And so the experience of waking up one day and going, okay, that's awful, but it's true, and I've admitted that it's true, and now I can decide what I'm going to do in that context. Um, that, I think, is the only hope that we really have, is that more and more people go through that process of kind of cracking open and deciding who they want to be in that cracked open world, what story they want to tell with their lives in that context. And as I say, the only technique I've found that helps people to get there, and helps me to get there, is just gently pointing out, well, hang on, you believe that, but you also value this. How do those fit together? And then leaving them to have that experience.
I completely agree and resonate with a lot of that. My own dark nights of the soul were things that I don't think I would have ever willingly chosen to go into, but now I
Mm.
count them among the greatest blessings of my life. And I live in a culture that doesn't really have a good support system for this. It says
Hmm.
that grieving is something to be done briefly, if at all, and we've got pills for it if it takes too long.
Yeah, right.
And in this podcast with Stephen Jenkinson, I've already referenced before, he talked about how grieving is a skill. It's not
Hmm.
something you do, it's not an event, it's a skill. And grieving itself is just another reflection of this idea of being able to sit with these troubled times. A really great podcast I will now direct people to is with Charles Eisenstein, and I think the title pretty much captures the whole thing perfectly. And he calls it The Fertile Ground of Bewilderment. That we are in this time where you say, I can't go on, meaning there's no solution. There's no solution because we're not facing a problem. We're in predicament time. So
Yeah.
what do you do as an adult when you're faced with a predicament? Well, you do as best you can. You are with it. And so, Shaun, first time ever I've said this. I was talking with I speak at a lot of wealth conferences. I was speaking with a guy who resonated with my message. He's very on board. Could is in a position to help. He asked me flat out, Chris, how can I help you? And for the first time in my life, I said, I don't know. I should know, right? I'm the guy working on this stuff. I should have this. Here you go, slot right in. Here's a role. And
Yeah.
I just don't know because I'm in the I don't know stage of this
Right.
story. I knew more 3 years ago. I don't know as much anymore. And so that's a really, I want to, because you raised this, this is a really powerful place to be because it means somehow surrendering to the creativity of the moment. It's a very different thing from the not knowing is more powerful than the knowing at certain times. That's really what's coming up. And I'm fascinated to see the degree to which people are beginning to inhabit that territory.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we need to honor those times of not knowing, because I was talking before about the Hollywood stories. We
Hmm.
don't really see that. Like at best, you'll get a montage of not knowing, which lasts about 5 seconds, and then
Right.
suddenly they know again, and off we go.
Yeah.
And I love the phrase "the fertile void." That's something that I really value. Is like I don't know where to go, I don't know what to do. So what I need to do is slow down, create some space, and let things come into that. And it's funny you mentioned grieving because, David Fleming is one of the closest friends I ever had, and he died very suddenly at the end of 2010. He was in perfectly good health, and he went to visit some friends in Amsterdam, and he went to sleep one night, and he didn't wake up, and it was a complete shock. And in fact, we just co-authored that parliamentary report that you mentioned, and it was due out a month later, and that was, a hugely difficult thing to then decide. Okay, well, I need to get this report out. That's what he would have wanted. So I'm going to put my grief on hold for a bit and get this done. And then 3 weeks after David died, my fiance died equally suddenly.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So this is 10 years ago now, and it was a hell of a time. And, a lot of people say a lot of things to you when you're grieving that don't seem to mean much. I mean, I always thought condolences is one of these words that it exists just because we don't know what to say. So we've created a word to put in place of our not knowing what to say.
Hmm.
But one person said something to me that really helped, and they said the best thing you can do for someone you love who dies is to keep alive what was best in them in the world. And that really just, yeah, I thought that now that sounds like a way of honoring these people. And at that time, I couldn't really motivate myself to do anything that except honoring them. And in the case of David, it was really clear that the best way that I could honor and keep alive what was best in him in the world was to get his life's work published. So in many ways now I'm at a point of kind of closing that circle and feeling like I don't think grieving ever ends. I don't think relationships ever end, even after death, to be honest. But it feels like my relationship with David and with Moria have found a good place to sit in me now. And I'm very much in that kind of fertile void place now of, so okay, what's now that I've closed that circle, what's my next chapter going to look like? But actually, one of the things that was really helpful is that David himself writes about this very question in Lean Logic. So it was very interesting to read him almost speaking to me about how to deal with his own death. And maybe I'll read that perhaps as a closing for our conversation.
Please do.
So this is the entry from the Dictionary for the Future on success. Do you really think that we will get through the climacteric and come in due course to a time of resilience, manners, and harmonic order? Don't answer that question, for you may discover to your cost that your answer is either a self-fulfilling or a self-denying truth, and that both count against us. If we deny that there is a livable future, then we will do little to secure one. If we affirm it, we come into other troubles, such as complacency, an optimistic view that what we are doing now is all that is needed, an iconic focus on the simple solution, or the constant anxiety of life on the edge between hope and doubt. Positive thinking seems to be the right thing in the circumstances, until you notice the wreckage.
Hmm.
Instead, think of what happened to Orpheus and Eurydice. Eurydice, you may remember, died after having been bitten by a snake, and Orpheus went down into the underworld to recover her. The goddess Persephone agreed to let her go on condition that Orpheus did not look back at her as she followed him. Unfortunately, he forgot about this condition. He did look back, with the result that Eurydice vanished forever, and Orpheus was torn to pieces by angry women who threw his head into the river Hebros, where it floated downstream, still singing. That is, make the intense commitment. At walking pace, plod on. Climb steeply uphill, out of the underworld. Keep your eyes fixed ahead. You never know, you might get there. You might even find out where there is, and you might inspire others to come with you. Just don't look back. We do not need to choose between hope and expectation. What matters is to keep hope alive, which we won't succeed in doing if we are constantly checking up on it. It is not certainty that sustains our focus, but the ambiguity that comes to us, for instance, in the prayer from another ancient moment of commitment against the odds. Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief.
Hmm.
Which I guess, yeah, ties in with the different senses in which people mean and use the word hope.
Absolutely, a beautiful passage. Thank you for reading that,
Mm.
and it really ties in to everything we've been talking about. So, I'm going to again recommend that people get a copy of Surviving the Future: Culture, Carnival, and Capital in the Aftermath of the Market Economy, because we're dealing with the synthesized work of a man who clearly spent a lot of time reading, synthesizing, understanding, tying it all together, and really, I think, speaking to the deeper mystery of what it means to be alive today, which I think at first pass has a sort of a dark element for people, which is like, shoot, right? But the
Yeah,
invitation on the backside of that is this is also one of the most exhilarating times to be alive because everything is going to be rewritten. So you can
yeah,
be part of that writing. And so that's an invitation to actually step into your gifts as a human during your brief mayfly existence here.
yeah.
So
And I'll
that's how
mention
I
as well
receive it.
that we're running a course at Schumacher College for those of your listeners in the UK in early February, the 6th to the 10th, on David Fleming's work, which is called Community Place and Play, a post-market economics. So there will be absolutely trying to write some of those pages that need to be rewritten. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. So if people wanted to find that and also follow your work more closely, where would they do that?
So my work is on darkoptimism.org. Schumacher College is schumachercollege.org.uk, and you click through to their short courses. Also, I'm on Twitter and Facebook under Dark Optimism, and you'll find me there. And David Fleming's work is the flemingpolicycentre.org.uk.
Well, thank you for those links. We'll have them as well at the bottom of this podcast at our website. If you are listening to this through the website, just scroll down. There they are. If you're listening to this elsewhere, say on YouTube or another site, just wander over to Peak Prosperity. Look under Featured Voices. You will see this interview with Shaun Chamberlin. Shaun, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Chris. It's been worthwhile.